Some ancient maps suggest something that doesn't appear in modern geography. Routes that seem to connect distant regions in ways that no longer exist. Near the vast territory once called Tartary, certain passages appear and disappear between different charts as if they were known and then forgotten. But what if these weren't just cartographic errors? What if there was once a hidden passage that allowed movement between worlds that later became isolated? When these maps are compared closely, a question begins to emerge. Was there a route connecting Tartary to the rest of the world that was quietly lost over time? For centuries, the expansion of empires depended on movement. Trade routes, maritime paths, and overland corridors shaped not only economies, but the way entire civilizations interacted with one another. Every known passage had value. Every navigable route meant access to resources, to influence, to power. And yet, despite this constant push for connection, some regions remained strangely distant for much longer than expected. Tartary was one of those regions. Across countless historical maps, it appeared as a vast and imposing territory, stretching across northern Asia with borders that were often unclear, but presence that was undeniable. It was not isolated in the sense of being unknown. It was recognized, labeled, and consistently included in geographic representations. But the ways of reaching it, those were far less certain. Because while southern trade routes between Europe and Asia became increasingly defined, crossing through the Middle East, India, and maritime passages controlled by powerful empires, the northern approaches remained inconsistent. Maps would sometimes suggest openings, rivers, or corridors that appeared to offer access into the interior of Tartary. But in later versions, those same paths would vanish, replaced by barriers, empty spaces, or ambiguous terrain. This inconsistency is where the idea of a hidden passage begins. Not necessarily a single road or a clearly marked route, but a network of access points that may have existed under conditions that were not always stable or reliable. Rivers that changed course. Seasonal pathways that only opened during certain times of the year. Maritime corridors blocked by ice for most of the time, but briefly navigable under specific conditions. To early explorers, these were not just inconveniences. They were uncertainties that could determine whether a journey succeeded or failed. And yet, despite these challenges, there are traces in old cartographic records that suggest attempts were made. Some maps show river systems extending deep into the interior, connecting distant regions in ways that seem unusually efficient. Others depict narrow land corridors between mountain ranges or coastal openings that imply access points into otherwise isolated territories. In certain cases, these features are drawn with surprising confidence, as if based on real reports rather than speculation. But then, in later maps, they are gone. This pattern repeats often enough to raise questions, because if these passages were purely imagined, why were they drawn so consistently across different maps? And if they were real, why did they not become permanent parts of established routes like so many others that were successfully integrated into global trade networks? One possible explanation lies in the nature of exploration itself. Early cartographers often worked with incomplete or secondhand information. Explorers would return with fragmented accounts, describing rivers that seemed to lead endlessly inland, or narrow coastal passages that appeared to connect distant seas. Without precise measurements, these descriptions could easily be interpreted in multiple ways, leading to maps that reflected possibility as much as certainty. In that sense, some of these hidden passages may have been exaggerations, misunderstandings, or projections of hope, routes that explorers believed could exist, even if they were never fully confirmed. But there is another way to interpret these recurring features. What if some of these passages did exist, but only temporarily? In regions shaped by extreme climates, especially near the northern edges of Asia, geography is not always stable. Rivers freeze and thaw, ice forms and breaks, coastlines shift under pressure from changing conditions. A route that is open one season may be completely inaccessible the next. To modern observers, this is well understood. But for early explorers, it could create the impression of something far more mysterious. A passage that appears, allows movement, and then disappears could easily be interpreted as unreliable. or even avoid it altogether in favor of safer, more predictable routes. Over time, that avoidance could lead to something else: absence. Because routes that are not used regularly are not reinforced with knowledge. They are not mapped with precision. They are not passed down with confidence. Instead, they fade, first from practice, and then from representation. And that may be what happened to certain pathways connected to Tartary. As southern trade routes became dominant, supported by powerful empires and consistent navigation, the need to explore uncertain northern or inland passages diminished. Investment followed stability. Attention shifted toward routes that could guarantee return, and slowly, the less reliable paths were left behind. But traces of them remained, in old maps, in fragmented records, in unusual connections that appear briefly and then vanish. Not enough to form a clear narrative, but enough to suggest that something once existed, something that allowed movement where today we see separation. And that is where the mystery deepens. Because if Tartary was as vast as these maps suggest, and if it was connected to surrounding regions in ways that are no longer visible, then the question is not just about geography. It is about access. How did people enter and leave such a massive territory? How did goods move across its expanse? And why do the routes that might answer those questions seem so inconsistent across historical records? Some researchers believe that the answer lies not in a single hidden passage, but in a network of routes that were never fully understood from the outside. Internal pathways that connected regions efficiently within Tartary itself, but were difficult for external powers to access or replicate. In that scenario, the hidden passage is not a single road but a system, one that functioned under conditions that outsiders could not easily navigate. Others suggest that certain routes may have been intentionally underrepresented or poorly documented, especially if they were controlled by groups that had no interest in making them widely known. And while there is no definitive evidence to confirm such ideas, the pattern of appearing and disappearing connections continues to invite speculation. Because when a path shows up repeatedly, even inconsistently, it becomes difficult to ignore entirely. And when that path leads into one of the most mysterious regions ever labeled on a map, it becomes something more than just a cartographic detail. It becomes a question that refuses to settle. And perhaps the most intriguing part is this: we may not be looking at a lost road. We may be looking at the remnants of a connection that once existed, but was never meant to be permanent. Because when those maps are placed side by side and examined without rushing to conclusions, the pattern does not feel random. It feels selective. Certain routes are emphasized for a time, then quietly abandoned in later representations, even when surrounding details become more precise. It creates the impression that knowledge was not simply expanding outward in a straight line, but shifting, sometimes advancing, sometimes retracting, sometimes redefining itself in ways that are difficult to trace. And within that shifting landscape, Tartary remains at the center of one of the most curious inconsistencies. If access to this vast region was as limited as some records suggest, then every possible entry point would have been significant. Rivers flowing from the south, coastal openings from the north, narrow corridors between mountain ranges. These would not have been minor details. They would have been essential. And yet, the way they appear in early maps does not always match how they are treated later. In some cases, rivers that once seemed to connect deep inland are shortened, redirected, or removed entirely. In others, coastal passages that hinted at navigable routes become solid, unbroken barriers. It is not simply that the maps become more accurate, it is that certain possibilities disappear. And that distinction matters, because accuracy usually replaces uncertainty with clarity. But here, in some instances, it seems to replace possibility with limitation. That raises an uncomfortable question. Were these early cartographers overestimating what was possible, or were later interpretations narrowing the picture based on different priorities? To understand that, it helps to consider how maps were actually created. Cartographers did not travel everywhere themselves. They relied on reports from explorers, traders, emissaries, and sometimes even rumors. Each piece of information was filtered through interpretation before being translated into lines and shapes on a map. And once a map was published, It often influenced others, creating a chain of repetition where certain ideas persisted longer than they should have, or disappeared faster than expected. In that chain, something subtle can happen. Information does not just accumulate, it competes. Some details are reinforced by repeated confirmation. Others are quietly discarded when they cannot be easily verified. And in regions where access is difficult, verification itself becomes rare. That means entire features, rivers, passages, even connections between regions, can exist in one generation of maps and be gone in the next, not because they were proven false, but because they were never proven with enough certainty. And Tartary, by its very nature, was one of the hardest regions to verify. Its scale alone made consistent exploration difficult. Its climate introduced unpredictable conditions. Its distance from European centers of power limited direct observation. All of this created an environment where knowledge was always incomplete, always subject to revision. But even within that uncertainty, some patterns feel too consistent to ignore. There are maps where inland routes appear to link distant parts of Eurasia in ways that would significantly reduce travel time compared to known southern paths. These are not detailed highways or clearly marked roads, but they suggest continuity. A sense that movement across these regions was more connected than later maps imply. And then, over time, that sense of continuity fades. The same regions begin to look more segmented. Distances feel greater. Natural barriers appear more absolute. What once seemed like a network becomes a series of isolated zones. And this is where interpretation begins to diverge again. One perspective sees this as refinement, the correction of overly optimistic or inaccurate early representations. From this view, the hidden passage never truly existed. It was a projection, an assumption that connections must exist simply because the land was there. But another perspective asks a different question. What if those early maps were not entirely wrong, just incomplete in a different way? What if the connections they hinted at were real, but dependent on conditions that were not constant? Seasonal routes, shifting waterways, temporary corridors that could not be relied upon year-round, pathways that required local knowledge to navigate, knowledge that did not transfer easily to outsiders documenting the region from afar. In that scenario, the hidden passage is not a myth. It is a reality that does not fit neatly into the kind of permanent, clearly defined geography that modern maps prefer. Because modern maps are designed for stability. They show what is consistently there, borders that hold, roads that remain, routes that can be depended on. But they are less effective at capturing what is temporary, conditional, or dependent on knowledge that cannot be easily standardized. And that may be why certain connections faded from representation, not because they never existed, but because they did not meet the criteria for permanence. Over time, as global navigation systems became more structured, as empires demanded clearer borders and more reliable routes, the value of uncertain pathways diminished. They were not useful for administration. They were not reliable for large-scale trade. They did not fit into a world that was becoming increasingly organized around predictability. So they were left behind, and eventually they were forgotten. But forgetting does not erase everything. Fragments remain, in maps that seem slightly out of place, in connections that appear once and never again, in patterns that only become visible when viewed across time, rather than in isolation. These fragments do not provide clear answers, but they do suggest that the story is more complex than a simple progression from ignorance to knowledge. Because if that were the case, we would expect maps to become steadily more detailed and consistent in one direction. Instead, we see moments where possibilities contract, where connections vanish, where the world appears to become more limited in certain respects, even as it becomes more precise in others. And that contradiction is difficult to ignore. It suggests that mapping the world was not just about discovering what existed, it was also about deciding what mattered enough to include. And once something is no longer included, it begins to disappear, not just from maps, but from collective awareness. Which brings us back to Tartary, a region that was once clearly present, consistently labeled, and widely recognized, but whose internal structure remains difficult to reconstruct today. If there were passages, whether rivers, corridors, or seasonal routes, that connected it to the rest of the world in ways we no longer fully understand, then their disappearance from maps may not tell us that they were never there. It may tell us that they were no longer seen as relevant, and relevance in the context of history is a powerful filter, because what is considered relevant gets preserved, repeated, and reinforced. What is not slowly fades into the background until it becomes a curiosity rather than a known fact. And the idea of a hidden passage connecting Tartary to the rest of the world now sits exactly in that space. Not fully accepted, not completely dismissed, but suspended somewhere in between, supported by traces that are just strong enough to raise questions, and just incomplete enough to prevent clear conclusions. And perhaps that is why the mystery persists, because it is not defined by a single piece of evidence, but by a pattern that only emerges when we look closely, and are willing to consider that some connections may have existed in ways that do not leave permanent marks behind. And the more this pattern is observed, the more it begins to challenge a simple assumption that everything important in history leaves behind a clear and permanent trace. Because in the case of these possible passages, what we see instead is something far more subtle. Not a well-documented route, not a preserved road, not a clearly defined corridor, but a sequence of indications that appear, shift, and then quietly disappear. It forces us to consider a different possibility, that some of the most significant connections in the past may not have been fixed at all. They may have depended on timing, on environment, on knowledge that was never fully written down. Routes that existed not as infrastructure but as opportunity. And once those opportunities were no longer understood, or no longer needed, they stopped being used. And once they stopped being used, they stopped being remembered. Because memory, just like maps, is selective. And over time, selection becomes reality. What remains is what gets repeated. What disappears is what falls outside of that repetition. So when we look back at Tartary, and we search for clear evidence of how such a vast region connected to the rest of the world, we may be expecting the wrong kind of answer. We may be looking for something permanent, when the truth, if it existed, may have been far more fluid. A passage that was not always there. A connection that required conditions to align. A route that could be found, but not easily preserved. And that would explain why it never became part of the dominant narrative, because dominant narratives are built on stability. They favor what can be confirmed, repeated, and controlled. They are shaped by what can be measured, mapped, and standardized. Anything that exists outside of that, anything uncertain, temporary, or difficult to verify, becomes harder to include, not necessarily because it is false, but because it does not fit. And over time, what does not fit begins to fade, until all that remains are fragments, like the ones we see in those old maps. Small hints of something larger, connections that almost make sense but never fully resolve, details that feel too deliberate to be random yet too incomplete to be definitive. And that is where the idea of a hidden passage continues to exist, not as a proven fact, not as a dismissed myth, but as a possibility. One that sits in the space between what was recorded and what may have been experienced. Because history is not just built from what survives, it is also shaped by what disappears. And sometimes what disappears leaves behind just enough to remind us that there may be more to the story than we currently understand. So the next time you look at an old map, pay attention not only to what is clearly drawn, but to what feels uncertain. The faint lines, the unusual connections, the routes that seem to lead somewhere, and then stop. Because in those details, you might be looking at the edges of something that once existed, but was never fully captured. And maybe that is the closest we can get to understanding it. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think these shifting routes were simply mistakes and misinterpretations? Or could they be traces of real connections that were lost over time? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your perspective might add a new piece to this puzzle. And if you enjoy exploring mysteries like this, hidden history and the unanswered questions left behind in ancient maps, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.